So now that we've had a look at what's the code inside our app delegate, this is a good time to go back into our to-do list view controller and fix all of these errors that we've got by switching over from a custom class that's saved using plist to our core data model. And in the process, we'll learn about how to create, or rather save, data using core data. So the first thing that we need to change is that instead of creating a new item as a new object of item, we actually need to initialize our core data object a little bit differently. So if we say let new item equals item, which if you remember is our core data class. So if you hold down Option and click on it, you can see it's an object of the type NSManaged object. And if we open a round bracket to initialize it, then we get to specify the context where this item is going to exist. So what is that context? Well, it's basically going to be the view context of our persistent container. So while we're inside the same class, it's easy to access this variable called persistent container. But if we're inside to-do list view controller, how do we create that context? We can't just say let context equal app delegate dot persistent container dot view context. And the reason why this doesn't work is because app delegate is a class. It's not the object of app delegate. So remember, when we refer to the to-do list view controller, for example, we won't try to call its methods or grab its properties by calling the class. Instead, we need to get the object of app delegate. So this would be the blueprint, and we need to get the object that's created from the blueprint. So this, again, is where our handy singletons come into use. And instead of calling app delegate, I'm instead going to tap into UI application dot shared, and this is a singleton app instance. And at the time point when our app is running live inside the user's iPhone, then this shared UI application will correspond to our live application object. And inside this shared UI application object, there's something called delegate. And this is the delegate of the app object, alternatively known as the app delegate. And we're going to downcast it as our class app delegate. So let's just give you a bit more space to see that whole line as it is. So we're tapping into the UI application class. We're getting the shared singleton object, which corresponds to the current app as an object, tapping into its delegate, which has the data type of an optional UI application delegate. We're casting it into our class app delegate, and because they both inherit from the same superclass UI application delegate, this is perfectly valid, and we now have access to our app delegate as an object. So we're able to tap into its property called persistent container, and we're going to grab the view context of that persistent container. So we can now say our context is this context. Now, the next error that we have is inside save items. And because we're no longer using the encoder, we can delete that, and we have to delete all of this as well. So what we ultimately need to do inside our save items method is we need to be able to commit our context to permanent storage inside our persistent container. And in order to do that, we need to call try context.save. And that basically transfers what's currently inside our staging area or our scratch pad, that's the context, to our permanent data stores. So inside the do block, we need to be able to say context.save. Now, where are we going to get our context? Well, it's going to be exactly the same as this. So we can either copy and paste it over here, or whenever you're copy and pasting the exact same pieces of code, then it's a good time point to evaluate. Maybe we should make it a shared constant up here. So now, instead of having this long line of code here, we can simply say let new item equals item, and the context is going to be self.context because we're inside a closure. And down here we can simply say context.save and mark it with the try keyword. And inside the catch block, we're going to print and say error saving context with this error message. So all that we've done so far is to set up the code to use core data for saving our new items that have been added using the UI alert. So I'm going to comment out the load items function, and I'm also going to comment out the part where we call that function. And if we want to be able to use item, which if you remember is an NS managed object, so it's something that only exists in the core data framework, then of course we also need to import core data. And now those errors will go away. So if I run the app now, you're going to see that we're going to come into an interesting bug. So when I hit add, let's create a new item. And once I hit add item, you can see it show up inside the table view, but that's only because it's being added to an array. And if we drag up our debug console, we'll see the reason. And it gives us an error with a code, and it says error saving context. So that of course refers to this line here. And this is the error that we're catching because we wrote this error saving context, remember? And the error message is the operation couldn't be completed because if we have a look at our data, we've got this item called done and it's equal to nil. So because our item done is not optional, we have to provide it with a value when we create our new item. So over here, in addition to adding a title, we're going to set the done to false for every single new item that we add into our table view, which makes sense, right? Because everything starts off being not done. So let's run our app again and see if this now works. So let's add a new item. And now you can see that the item has been added to the table view and we don't get any errors in our debug console from that catch block. So the problem though is that right now we haven't yet got code that loads our items from our core data model. And if I terminate this app and I reopen it, you can see that we have no items in here. But we did save our data using core data and we didn't get any errors, so it succeeded. So how can I prove this to you? Well, in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how you can view your SQLite database and see the items that get saved into it. So for all of that and more, see you on the next lesson.